Before history learned how to record itself, Egypt learned how to endure. While other civilizations measured greatness by conquest and expansion, Egypt measured it by alignment with time, with nature, and with forces far older than human ambition. It did not rush toward the future. It positioned itself so the future would eventually return to it. Along the banks of the Nile, a civilization emerged that believed existence did not end, but continued under rules that could be understood, prepared for, and obeyed. Kings ruled not by charisma, but by responsibility. Gods were not distant ideals, but systems embedded in stone, ritual, and rhythm. Death was not an accident. Titi was a destination with instructions. For more than 3,000 years, Egypt remained recognizable, while the world around it transformed. Empires conquered its land. Religions replaced its gods. Languages buried its voice. Yet Egypt never vanished. It withdrew into layers of meaning, waiting to be rediscovered. This is not the story of a fallen empire. It is the story of a civilization that solved the problem of time and refused to disappear. Chapter 1: Egypt, a civilization that refused to die before there were empires that conquered continents, before kings ruled by law or sword. Egypt ruled by time itself. When other civilizations rose and fell within centuries, Egypt endured for millennia, changed in spirit, unbroken in belief. Dynasties collapsed, invaders came and went, yet Egypt remained. Not because it was powerful in the way Rome was powerful, but because it understood something deeper. Eternity is not conquered. It is aligned with the Nile, was not merely a river. It was a calendar, a god, a promise. Each year it flooded, retreating with mathematical precision long before mathematics had a name. In its rhythm, Egyptians learned that ordemat was not enforced by armies, but sustained by balance. To live in Egypt was to live inside a cosmic agreement. Pharaohs were not kings in the human sense. They were anchors between worlds, living bridges between the mortal and the eternal. Their authority did not come from conquest, but from responsibility. If the floods failed, if famine came, if chaos spread, it was not merely a political failure, it was a cosmic one. And so power in Egypt was inseparable from death. Where other civilizations feared the end, Egypt prepared for it with architectural obsession. Pyramids were not monuments of arrogance. They were machines of continuity. Stone by stone, Egypt declared that life did not end, transformed, preserved, awaited judgment. Death was not the opposite of life. It was its next office. Every tomb was stocked not with luxury, but with instructions. Every wall was carved not with decoration, but with spells, maps, and warnings. The afterlife was bureaucratic, moral, and terrifyingly precise. The heart would be weighed. Memory would matter. Names would determine survival. To be forgotten was the only true death. Egypt's cities rose under the sun like reflections of heaven. Temples aligned with stars not yet catalogued. Obelisks pierced the sky as frozen rays of sunlight. Even stone obeyed belief here. Even silence carried meaning. But eternity has a cost. Because to remain unchanged is also to resist adaptation. As centuries passed, Egypt became a civilization perfected for yesterday. New powers emerged faster, more aggressive, less patient with gods who spoke slowly. Hyksos, Assyrians, Persians, Greeks, Romans each arrived believing they would finally break Egypt. None truly did. They ruled Egypt's land, but Egypt ruled their imagination. Foreign kings dressed as pharaohs, conquerors bowed to old gods. Rome itself, master of the Mediterranean, could not rule Egypt without pretending to become Egyptian. Cleopatra spoke the ancient tongue when others would not. Augustus controlled the grain, but the myths controlled him. Egypt did not collapse, it sank into layers. Like its own tombs buried beneath sand, Egypt receded from power, but not from existence. Its symbols outlived its armies. Its ideas survived the destruction of its temples. Its gods migrated, renamed, absorbed, misunderstood, but never erased. Even now, thousands of years later, humanity still looks to Egypt when asking the same question Egypt asked first: what survives us? Civilizations may conquer land, but only a few conquer time. Egypt did not race against history. It slowed it down, carved it into stone, and waited. This is the story of a civilization that never expected to end, only to be remembered. Chapter 2: Egypt Gods Who Walked Among Stone and Sun in Egypt. The gods were never distant. They did not live beyond the sky, nor hide in abstraction. They walked beside humans in temples, in statues, in animals, in the daily movement of the sun itself. To be Egyptian was not to believe in gods. It was to live inside their presence. Every force of nature had a face. Every uncertainty had a name. Ra did not merely represent the sun, aging each day, reborn each dawn. Osiris was not just a god of the dead. He was the proof that death could be defeated through order, ritual, and memory. Isis was devotion made flesh, magic woven through love and grief. Horus was legitimacy, kingship, the living eye that watched over the land. And Set, chaos, violence, desert. Storm was not evil to be erased, but danger to be contained. Egyptian religion was not a battle between good and evil. It was a negotiation between order and disorder. Chaos could never be destroyed. It could only be restrained. And that task fell not only to the gods, but to humans themselves. This is why ritual mattered more than faith. A prayer spoken incorrectly could destabilize the cosmos. A ceremony skipped could weaken Maat. Words, gestures, symbols, these were not metaphors. They were technologies. The universe functioned because the correct actions were performed at the correct time by the correct people. Priests were not preachers. They were technicians of reality. Within temple walls, rituals were carried out with obsessive precision. Gods were awakened, fed, clothed, and praised daily. Statues were washed like living beings. Incense did not symbolize reverence, it sustained divine presence. Without ritual, the gods might withdraw, and the world would drift toward chaos. The average Egyptian never entered the deepest parts of the temple. The divine was near, but still dangerous. To see too much, to approach incorrectly, was to invite annihilation. Sacred knowledge was layered, guarded, filtered through hierarchy. Power followed the same logic. The pharaoh was not a god by personal virtue. He was divine by function. His role was to maintain Maat on a national scale, to keep the gods satisfied. The floods predictable, the borders secure, the dead remembered. When he failed, famine followed. When order collapsed, rebellion was not merely political, it was cosmic. This made disobedience a form of blasphemy. Yet, Egyptian gods were not moral judges in the modern sense. They did not demand purity of thought or belief. They demanded continuity. You could doubt, question, even fear them, but you could not neglect them. And above all, you could not forget them. The most feared punishment was not hellfire. It was erasure. To have one's name destroyed, one's image defaced, one's memory removed. This was a fate worse than death. Without remembrance, the soul could not navigate the afterlife. Without a name, existence unraveled. This is why Egypt carved endlessly. Walls became texts, statues became backups, tombs became archives. Identity was etched into stone to survive fire, flood, and time itself. Even gods were bound to material representation. If a statue was destroyed, the god's influence weakened in that place. Belief was physical, but belief also evolved. Over centuries, gods merged, split, absorbed one another. Ra fused with Ammon. Local deities gained national importance. Foreign gods were adopted, adapted, sometimes resisted. Egyptian religion was conservative in ritual, but flexible in theology. As long as Mat held, the system endured. Yet cracks formed. As foreign rulers took control, rituals continued, but sincerity thinned. Temples grew richer, while peasants grew poorer. Gods became distant, not because they left, but because humans could no longer afford to serve them properly. The old balance strained. When Rome arrived, Egyptian gods were still powerful, but no longer unquestioned. Christianity would later challenge the entire system, rejecting ritual precision in favor of belief, replacing cosmic order with moral absolutism. Temples closed, statues fell silent, rituals stopped, and yet something remained. Egyptian gods did not vanish, they transformed. Isis became a universal mother. Osiris echoed in resurrection myths. The weighing of the heart survived in altered forms of judgment. The language changed, the structure collapsed, but the ideas endured, because Egypt's greatest creation was not a god or a monument. It was the realization that meaning must be maintained, not discovered. And once that idea enters human history, it never truly leaves. Chapter 3. Egypt, the architecture of eternity. Egypt did not build for the living. It built for those who would remain. Where other civilizations measured success by expansion, Egypt measured it by duration. Stone was chosen not for beauty, but for memory. Mud brick was for houses. Limestone and granite were for the soul. What mattered most was not what endured a lifetime, but what survived beyond names, beyond dynasties, beyond history itself. Architecture in Egypt was theology made physical. The pyramid was not an act of vanity. It was a solution to a metaphysical problem. How does a mortal body participate in eternity? The answer was geometry. The pyramid's shape mirrored the rays of the sun, allowing the pharaoh's spirit to ascend and merge with Ra. Its alignment with cardinal directions was not symbolic, it was navigational, ensuring the soul would not lose its way. Every measurement mattered. Every angle carried belief. Inside, corridors narrowed, chambers deepened. Traps misled intruders, not only to protect treasure, but to safeguard continuity. The body had to remain intact. The name had to remain readable. The image had to remain visible. Destruction of any one threatened annihilation. This obsession with permanence reshaped society. Thousands labored not as slaves, but as participants in a cosmic project. Farmers worked on monuments during flood seasons, their labor transformed into a sacred offering. To build a tomb was to secure not just a king's afterlife, but the stability of the universe itself. Temples followed the same logic. They were not places of congregation, but of procession. Movement through space mirrored movement through time, from chaos at the entrance to order at the sanctuary. Darkness deepened as one approached the god. Ceilings lowered. Silence thickened. Architecture disciplined the body into reverence. Columns bloomed like papyrus, recalling creation itself. Reliefs repeated endlessly, because repetition was protection. What is repeated cannot vanish. What is carved cannot lie. But Egypt's greatest architectural insight was not size, it was redundancy. Names were written again and again. Spells were duplicated. Statues stood in multiples. Tombs contained false doors, backup chambers, substitute bodies. If one failed, another would hold. Eternity, Egypt understood, required contingency planning. Even failure was anticipated. As dynasties weakened, pyramids shrank. Resources thinned. Yet belief did not collapse. Mastabas replaced pyramids. Rock-cut tombs replaced stone mountains. The Valley of the Kings hid rather than displayed eternity, acknowledging that visibility now invited destruction. Adaptation entered quietly. Here, architecture became camouflage. Tombs vanished into cliffs. Decoration retreated inward. What mattered was no longer awe, but survival. Eternity no longer demanded spectacle-only secrecy, and still Egypt built. Even as foreign powers ruled, temples rose. Even as languages changed, stone inscriptions persisted. Even when gods were challenged, their houses remained standing long after their voices faded. Today, ruins dominate Egypt's landscape. Broken columns, collapsed roofs, erased faces. At first glance, it seems Egypt failed. But this is an illusion, because we are still looking. Tourists circle pyramids, scholars decode walls, engineers marvel at precision unmatched for millennia. Egypt succeeded in its true objective, to be encountered by the future. A civilization is not measured by what it preserves of itself, but by what it forces others to remember. Egypt ensured that forgetting would require effort, and effort, over time, becomes reverence. Stone outlives belief. Form outlasts meaning. But together, they trap attention. Egypt did not conquer the world. It conquered human curiosity. And curiosity is the longest-lasting empire of all. Chapter 4. Egypt, the river that taught humans time. Civilizations usually form around power. Egypt formed around predictability. At the center of everything was the Nile, not as scenery, not as resource, but as instruction. Long before clocks, calendars, or written history, the river taught Egyptians how time behaves. It arrived, withdrew, and returned with such reliability that it transformed chaos into expectation. The Nile did not rush, it did not surprise, it kept promises. Each year, as the waters rose and spread across the floodplain, they erased boundaries, fields disappeared, property dissolved. The land returned to a blank state. Then, slowly, the waters retreated, leaving behind black, silt-fertile, measured, sufficient. Agriculture resumed. Life restarted. This was not disaster, it was design. From this rhythm, Egypt learned a radical idea. Time is not a line rushing toward an end. It is a cycle that renews meaning. Where other cultures feared repetition as stagnation, Egypt embraced it as stability. The future was not unknown, it was rehearsed. This belief reshaped everything. Seasons were defined not by temperature, but by water. The year was divided into flooding, growing and harvesting acts of cooperation with nature rather than domination over it. Work followed the river's will. Even gods moved with its rhythm. Hapi, the god of the Nile, was neither male nor female, neither warrior nor judge. He was abundance embodied, worshipped not for morality, but for reliability. Offerings were made not to ask for miracles, but to ensure continuity. The river demanded respect, not control. From the Nile came Egypt's obsession with measurement. Flood levels were tracked. Nilometers recorded water height with religious seriousness. Too little water meant famine. Too much meant destruction. Balance was everything. Mat was not an abstract virtue, it was a hydrological requirement. The calendar followed suit. Egypt created one of the earliest solar calendars, aligning human activity with celestial and environmental cycles. Time became structured, divisible, predictable. Festivals marked cosmic events, rituals synchronized with seasons. Life was scheduled according to the universe. This removed anxiety. When you believe tomorrow will resemble yesterday, fear loses its grip. Egypt did not innovate rapidly because it did not need to. Stability was not a flautot, was the goal. The river rewarded patience, punished haste, and ignored ambition. But this intimacy with predictability carried risk, because when change finally arrived, it arrived without precedent. Droughts occurred, floods failed, climate shifted, external pressures mounted. The Nile, once perfectly reliable, became uncertain. And when the river faltered, Egypt's worldview trembled. Faith strained. Priests performed rituals more intensely. Offerings increased. Temples expanded. The system responded not by questioning its assumptions, but by reinforcing them. If order weakened, the solution had to be more order. Yet nature does not negotiate with belief. As centuries passed, the Nile's cycles changed subtly. Political instability disrupted infrastructure. Canals decayed. Maintenance failed. The river that once unified Egypt now exposed its vulnerabilities. Empires elsewhere adapted faster because they had never relied on predictability. Egypt, perfected for continuity, struggled with disruption. Still, the Nile did not abandon Egypt. Even as foreign rulers came, the river remained the same teacher. Greeks studied it. Romans exploited it. Control of Egypt meant control of grain, and grain meant control of empires. Rome fed itself with Egyptian harvests. Without the Nile, Rome would have starved. Power shifted, but dependence remained. In this way, Egypt outlived its sovereignty. Though conquered, it remained indispensable. The river preserved relevance even when armies failed. Geography became destiny long after politics collapsed. And today, the lesson persists. Modern dams attempt to discipline the Nile. Satellites track it, engineers manage it, but the fundamental truth remains unchanged. Societies thrive not by defeating nature, but by learning its patterns. Egypt's greatness was never mystical. It was observational. It watched carefully, trusted cycles, and built meaning from repetition. When history accelerates, this approach appears slow, but slowness, when aligned with reality, becomes endurance. The Nile did not promise progress, it promised continuation, and for thousands of years that was enough. This made Egyptian politics remarkably stable and dangerously inflexible. What had worked before would work again until it didn't. Migrants assimilated. Foreigners served as mercenaries. The system bent, but did not break. The Hyksos introduced new military technologies. And yet Egypt learned. Maintaining distant territories required speed, flexibility, and constant response. Egypt was optimized for maintenance, not momentum. Supply lines strained, control weakened. As Assyrians, Persians, Greeks, and Romans rose each faster, more adaptive, Egypt was overtaken. Egypt's kings eventually became ceremonial. Temples overshadowed palaces. Priests gained influence as military strength faded. Spiritual authority replaced political dominance. Yet even then, Egypt did not vanish. Its art influenced empires. Its gods shaped theology. Its concepts of order, judgment, and afterlife filtered into new belief systems. Speed won territory. Slowness won legacy. Egypt teaches an uncomfortable truth. Civilizations do not fail because they are weak, but because they are built for a world that no longer exists. And sometimes, refusing to change is not ignorance, it is a decision to endure differently. Chapter 6: Egypt, Death as a System, not an ending in Egypt. Death was not feared, it was organized. While other cultures treated death as interruption or mystery, Egypt treated it as a process, one that could be prepared for, optimized, and navigated with sufficient knowledge. Life was temporary, but transition was manageable. The afterlife was not a reward. It was an examination. To die was to enter a system governed by rules stricter than any earthly law. The soul fractured into parts, the Ka, the Ba, the Akij, requiring preservation, recognition, and guidance. If any component failed, existence dissolved. This made preparation essential. Mummification was not superstition. it was logistics. The body had to remain recognizable so the BA could return. Organs were removed, preserved, stored with labels and guardians. The heart remained, the seat of identity and memory. Without it, judgment was impossible. Tombs were manuals. Walls were inscribed with spells, directions, passwords. The Book of the Dead was not literature, was a user guide. The dead were instructed how to speak, when to speak, what to deny. Silence at the wrong moment meant annihilation. At the center stood the scale. The heart was weighed against the feather of mat. Not belief, not loyalty, not status balance, determined survival. A life lived in excess, in deception, in disruption, tipped the scale. Failure was not punishment, it was erasure. The soul was consumed, forgotten. Eternal life required restraint. This belief disciplined society. Ethics were not enforced by fear of hell, but by fear of disappearance. To be remembered was to exist. To be just was to be light enough to endure. Memory became currency. Names were repeated endlessly. Statues served as backup identities. Even commoners aspired to modest tombs, not for luxury, but for recognition. The poorest Egyptian still sought a name that could be spoken again. But this system had limits. As populations grew, resources thinned. Elaborate tombs became inaccessible. The promise of structured eternity narrowed to elites. Ritual precision eroded. Shortcuts appeared. Spells were copied incorrectly. Faith shifted from certainty to hope. Death remained central but less controlled. Foreign religions arrived, offering something radical: salvation without preparation, judgment without ritual, eternity without bureaucracy. For many, this was liberation. For Egypt, it was destabilization. The old system required investment. The new ones required belief. Gradually, the architecture of death collapsed. Tombs were looted, names erased, bodies decayed without ceremony. Egypt's greatest obsession lost its infrastructure. And yet, the idea survived. The concept of moral judgment after death endured. The weighing of actions, the survival of the worthy, the annihilation of the unjust, these principles migrated into new theologies. Egypt's system dissolved, but its logic remained embedded in human consciousness. Death, Egypt taught, is not frightening because it ends life. It is frightening because it demands accountability. And accountability, once introduced, never disappears. Chapter 7. Egypt when foreigners ruled the gods. Egypt was conquered many times, but it was never easily ruled. Invaders could seize cities, command armies, even crown themselves pharaohs. What they could not immediately control was meaning. Egypt's power did not reside solely in land or lit, resided in ritual, myth, and cosmic legitimacy. To govern Egypt, one had to become Egyptian. Most tried. The Hyksos learned this first. Foreign rulers of the Delta, they adopted Egyptian titles, worshipped local gods, and ruled through existing structures. They understood instinctively that domination without assimilation invited collapse. Later empires followed the same pattern. Assyrians brought terror. Persians brought administration. Greeks brought philosophy. Romans brought bureaucracy. Yet all bowed, at least outwardly, to Egypt's ancient logic. Temples remained active. Priests retained authority. Gods were honored even when kings were foreign. Power wore Egyptian clothing. Alexander the Great did not conquer Egypt as an enemy. He entered as a liberator. He consulted the oracle of Ammon, received divine endorsement, and allowed himself to be named son of the god. With a single ritual, conquest transformed into legitimacy. The Ptolemies mastered this performance. Greek by blood, Egyptian by image, they ruled through careful duality. Cleopatra spoke the ancient language when others would not. Coins bore Egyptian symbols. Temples were restored. Isis rose to international prominence under their patronage. Egypt did not resist them, it absorbed them. Rome was less subtle. To Rome, Egypt was not sacred, it was strategic. Grain fed the empire. Control of the Nile meant control of the Mediterranean. Emperors ruled Egypt directly, bypassing the Senate, understanding that whoever held Egypt held Rome's stomach. And yet, even Rome complied. Augustus restricted senators from entering Egypt without permission, not out of respect, but fear. Egypt was different. Too rich, too ancient, too psychologically dangerous. Roman emperors were crowned pharaohs in reliefs, even as they dismantled political autonomy. The illusion of continuity was maintained, but illusions erode. Over time, temple funding declined. Priestly influence waned. Roman pragmatism hollowed ritual of urgency. Gods became aesthetic rather than essential. Worship continued, but conviction thinned. Then came a force Egypt could not absorb. Christianity did not seek to integrate, it sought to replace. It rejected the necessity of ritual precision. It dismissed local gods as false. It offered salvation independent of tradition and community independent of geography. For the first time, Egypt's gods faced extinction. Temples closed, statues were destroyed, names were erased deliberately, not by accident. What Egypt feared most forgetting was imposed systematically, and yet the victory was incomplete. Egyptian symbols survived beneath new language. The mother goddess reappeared in new forms. Judgment after death remained central. Sacred architecture influenced churches. Monastic traditions mirrored temple isolation. Egypt's gods fell, but their shadows ruled on. Foreigners never fully ruled Egypt's soul. They inherited fragments, repurposed them, carried them forward. Conquest ended sovereignty, but not influence. Egypt teaches that domination is temporary, but cultural gravity is permanent, and gravity bends even empires. Chapter 8. Egypt knowledge buried and rediscovered. Egypt did not disappear, it went silent. When temples closed and rituals ceased, the machinery of meaning stopped operating, but the records remained. Stone does not forget simply because voices fade. Walls still spoke, though no one could read them. Knowledge slept beneath sand, waiting for a future that no longer remembered how to listen. For centuries, Egypt was misinterpreted. Travelers saw ruins and imagined magic. Greeks admired monuments, but misunderstood their purpose. Romans looted without comprehension. Later generations reduced Egypt to mystery, superstition, or allegory. The language of the gods became decoration. Hieroglyphs turned into symbols without sound. This was Egypt's second death, not destruction, but opacity. Meaning was lost, not because it was erased, but because it was unreadable. Knowledge without interpretation is indistinguishable from silence. The world moved on. Empires rose and fell. Religions transformed landscapes. Science redefined truth. And Egypt remained immobile, half-buried, dismissed as ancient excess, until it spoke again. The rediscovery was not sudden. It began with curiosities copying inscriptions, travelers sketching ruins, collectors transporting artifacts, but without language, understanding stalled. Egypt remained impressive, but unintelligible. Then came a fragment of chance. The Rosetta Stone was not valuable because of what it said, but because it said the same thing 3 times. Greek, Demotic, hieroglyphic, one message, 3 scripts. Redundancy, once again, saved Egypt. It always had. When Champollion cracked the code, Egypt re-entered history not as myth, but as voice. Hieroglyphs regained grammar, names resurfaced, kings reclaimed identity, the dead spoke, and what they said surprised the modern world. Egypt was not mystical nonsense. It was systematic, logical, administratively sophisticated. Astronomy, medicine, engineering, ethics, woven into ritual, not opposed to it. Science had existed long before the word. Modernity had misjudged Egypt because it mistook symbolism for irrationality. Knowledge had been hidden, not because it was secret, but because its language was forgotten. Once rediscovered, Egypt reshaped understanding of civilization itself. It forced humanity to confront uncomfortable truths that progress is not linear, that ancient cultures solved problems later civilizations would forget, that modern arrogance is often built on selective memory. Museums filled, textbooks changed. Egypt returned not as living civilization, but as foundational reference. But rediscovery brought new conflict. Artifacts were removed, displayed far from their context. Knowledge was extracted, categorized, archived. Egypt was studied, but not restored. Interpretation replaced participation. The culture became object rather than environment. Meaning survived, but intimacy did not. And yet, Egypt's final lesson persisted. Knowledge can be buried, distorted, ignored, but it cannot be permanently destroyed if it is recorded with intention. Silence is not absence, it is latency. Egypt waited thousands of years for its words to be heard again, and when they were, humanity realized it had never truly left. Chapter NINE. Egypt, the illusion of decline. History insists that Egypt fell. Egypt insists otherwise. What modern narratives describe as decline was, in reality, a change in visibility. Egypt did not collapse in a single moment, nor did it surrender its identity willingly. It receded layer by layer beneath new languages, new rulers, and new beliefs, while continuing to function beneath the surface. Decline assumes failure. Egypt practiced withdrawal. By the late Roman period, Egypt no longer resembled the civilization that raised pyramids or commanded divine kingship. Temples closed. Hieroglyphs vanished from daily use. The old priesthood dissolved. From the outside, Egypt appeared finished, but internally, continuity persisted. Villages followed the same agricultural rhythms governed by the Nile. Social structures adapted rather than disappeared. Sacred spaces were repurposed, not erased. Old festivals transformed into new religious calendars. The framework survived even as the symbols changed. Egypt did not die. It translated itself. This is why conquering powers never fully replaced it. Greek rule overlaid philosophy but relied on Egyptian administration. Roman authority extracted grain but preserved local order. Christianity replaced gods but inherited moral judgment, sacred architecture, and ritual rhythm. Each layer claimed dominance. Each layer rested on Egypt. What looked like decay was actually sedimentation. Egypt became a foundation rather than a facade. Invisible but load-bearing. Modern historians often mistake silence for absence. When texts stop speaking a familiar language, when monuments cease being built, when names fade from records, it is assumed that meaning has ended. Egypt contradicts this assumption. The civilization's greatest strength, its emphasis on endurance, meant that it did not resist change violently. It allowed itself to be overwritten, trusting that its structures would persist beneath whatever came next, and they did. Administrative divisions, established in pharaonic times, influenced later governance. Agricultural practices remained unchanged for millennia. Concepts of sacred authority informed religious hierarchy long after pharaohs vanished. Even Egypt's perception of time is layered rather than linear survived in cultural memory. What Egypt lost was visibility, not relevance. This challenges a core assumption of modern thought, that survival requires dominance. Egypt demonstrates the opposite. Influence can outlast power. Meaning can persist without control. In many ways, Egypt achieved a more complete form of survival than empires that burned brightly and vanished entirely. It embedded itself so deeply into the fabric of civilization that removal became impossible. This is why Egypt continues to unsettle historians. It refuses clear endpoints. It resists neat timelines. It undermines narratives of rise and fall. Egypt teaches that civilizations do not necessarily end when they are conquered, converted, or forgotten. They end only when their underlying logic becomes unusable. Egypt's logic balance, continuity, memory remains usable even now, and that is why it still matters. Chapter 10, Egypt. When memory becomes immortality. Egypt did not seek to be remembered. It designed remembrance. From its earliest dynasties, Egypt understood a truth most civilizations learn too late. Power fades, territory dissolves, belief shifts, but memory, if engineered correctly, can outlive them all. What Egypt built was not merely monuments or myths, but a self-sustaining system of recall. To exist was to be named. To be named was to endure. This is why Egypt carved relentlessly. Names were repeated on walls, statues, coffins, amulets, and tools. Redundancy was not artistic excess, it was existential insurance. If one inscription was damaged, another would survive. If one statue fell, another would still hold identity. Memory was distributed. Unlike later cultures that centralized legacy in texts or archives, Egypt embedded memory into landscape itself. Temples functioned as living records. Tombs were libraries. Even everyday objects carried inscriptions, anchoring individuals to eternity. This democratized survival, at least in theory. While elites enjoyed grand monuments, common people still sought modest remembrance. A stela, a name scratched into stone, a figurine placed with care. The scale differed, but the logic remained. To be remembered is to continue, but memory required participation. Rituals ensured names were spoken. Offerings renewed relevance. Festivals reactivated. Without use, memory decayed. Egypt knew this and feared neglect more than destruction. A broken statue could be repaired. A forgotten god could not. This anxiety-shaped behavior. Families maintained tombs for generations. Priests preserved calendars meticulously. Kings restored monuments of predecessors, not out of nostalgia, but necessity. Continuity was collaborative. No one survived alone. Yet, memory has a paradox. The more one tries to preserve it, the more rigid it becomes. Egypt's reverence for the past eventually constrained the present. Innovation risked disrupting established narratives. New ideas struggled against ancient authority. Still, memory adapted quietly. When hieroglyphs disappeared, oral tradition compensated. When temples closed, stories migrated. When names were erased, concepts survived. Egypt's memory shifted mediums, but did not vanish. Even modern archaeology participates in this system. Every excavation reactivates a name. Every translation restores a voice. Scholars become unintended priests, performing acts of remembrance without ritual intent. Museums replace temples. Catalogs replace walls. The system persists. And here lies Egypt's final triumph. It transformed memory from sentiment into structure. It ensured that future civilizations, no matter how distant, would be forced to engage. You cannot encounter Egypt passively. It demands interpretation. It resists dismissal. To study Egypt is to participate in its afterlife. Other civilizations sought immortality through dominance. Egypt sought it through integration, bedding itself into the foundations of culture so deeply that removal became impossible. This is why Egypt never truly ended. As long as humans remember, record, and return to the past for meaning, Egypt remains present, not as empire, not as religion, but as method. A civilization that mastered memory, mastered time. Chapter 11. Egypt, the cost of eternity. Eternity demands payment. Egypt paid it in advance. To build a civilization that outlasts time, Egypt sacrificed something essential: flexibility. While its systems preserved order and memory, they also resisted transformation. What protected Egypt from chaos in one era became a burden in another. Stability hardened into doctrine. Rituals that once aligned humanity with the cosmos became obligations divorced from understanding. Repetition replaced reflection. Authority leaned on antiquity rather than effectiveness. The past was no longer a guide, was a restraint. This was the hidden cost of endurance. Egypt trained generations to revere what had been, not to imagine what could be. Innovation was permitted only if it disguised itself as restoration. New ideas survived by pretending they were ancient. Progress moved sideways, not forward. For centuries, this worked, but history accelerated. Neighboring civilizations evolved rapidly, militarily, politically, technologically. They adapted to disruption, embraced speed, and reorganized under pressure. Egypt, perfected for equilibrium, struggled in a world that rewarded change. The priesthood grew powerful as kings weakened. Sacred authority replaced practical governance. Decisions justified by tradition resisted evidence. When crises arose, economic strain, military defeat, social unrest, the system responded with more ritual, not reform. Eternity became inertia. Yet Egypt's collapse was not dramatic. There was no final battle, no definitive fall. The system simply became less capable of responding to reality. Control slipped quietly. Influence thinned, leadership fragmented. This subtle failure is why Egypt is often misunderstood. We look for catastrophe and find continuity instead. But decline does not always arrive as destruction. Sometimes it arrives as irrelevance. And still, Egypt did not vanish, because what it lost in power, it gained in perspective. Once freed from the burden of ruling itself eternally, Egypt became a resource for others, a repository of knowledge, symbolism, and structure. Its ideas lived on where its authority could not. The cost of eternity was sovereignty. Egypt chose to endure rather than dominate, to persist rather than prevail. It accepted being overwritten in exchange for being unforgettable. This trade would haunt later civilizations. Rome collapsed, trying to hold power forever. Empires fractured, chasing permanence. Egypt alone demonstrated that survival does not require control-only integration into the deeper logic of culture. Eternity, Egypt teaches, is not free. It costs ambition. It costs speed. It costs the right to define the future. But in return, it offers something no empire can claim: to remain present long after relevance has passed. Chapter 12. EGYPT. What endures when everything else falls? When Egypt finally stepped out of history's foreground, nothing dramatic announced its departure. No single date marked the end. No final ruler closed the door. No last monument declared completion. Egypt simply stopped, insisting on being seen. This is what makes it dangerous to misunderstand. Most civilizations end loudly. They collapse under invasion, fracture through revolution, or exhaust themselves through ambition. Their ruins testify to failure. Egypt's ruins testify to completion. It had already done what it came to do. By the time the last hieroglyphs were carved, Egypt had embedded its worldview so deeply into human civilization that direct control no longer mattered. Its gods could vanish. Its language could fall silent. Its political institutions could dissolve. The underlying architecture of thought remained intact: balance over dominance, memory over momentum, continuity over conquest. These were not Egyptian traits anymore. They were human inheritances. What endures, Egypt shows us, is never the visible structure. It is the logic beneath it. Empires believed land would preserve them. Egypt chose time. Kings believed armies would make them eternal. Egypt chose repetition. Religions believed faith would outlast stone. Egypt chose inscription, and inscription proved stronger. Even stripped of belief, Egypt continues to shape imagination. Its symbols appear in architecture, in law, in religion, in philosophy. Judgment after death, sacred order, the moral weight of balance, the terror of being forgotten. These ideas survived conquest because they answered questions that never stopped being asked. What makes a life meaningful? What justifies power? What survives death? What deserves remembrance? Egypt did not provide comforting answers. It provided structured ones. Meaning was not spontaneous. It had to be maintained. Justice was not emotional. It had to be measured. Eternity was not granted. It had to be prepared for. This is why Egypt remains unsettling. Modern civilizations pride themselves on speed, disruption, reinvention. Egypt stands as a rebuke. It suggests that progress without continuity is fragile, and innovation without memory is shallow. It reminds us that civilizations are not judged by how quickly they rise, but by how long their assumptions remain usable. Egypt's assumptions still are. We still record names to prevent disappearance. We still build monuments to stabilize memory. We still measure lives against ideals of balance. We still fear oblivion more than death. And we still return to Egypt when we want to understand what it means to last. This is not nostalgia, it is recognition. Egypt does not ask to be revived. It does not seek restoration. It requires no defense. It already won the only contest that matters: the struggle against irrelevance. When everything else falls, what endures is not power, or belief, or territory. What endures is structure. Egypt became structure, and structures do not die, they wait. Egypt never chased the future. It prepared for it. Long after its temples fell silent and its gods lost their names, Egypt continued to function in a quieter form, bedded in how humans think about time, death, authority, and memory. It did not survive as a nation, nor as a religion, but as a framework. This was its final refinement. Other civilizations tried to defeat time by accelerating, expanding, innovating, conquering. Egypt chose the opposite strategy. It slowed itself down until time had no leverage. By aligning with cycles instead of resisting them, Egypt turned endurance into a craft. Waiting became power. It waited through conquest. It waited through erasure. It waited through misunderstanding. And eventually, it was heard again. Egypt's story forces an uncomfortable realization. Civilizations are not remembered because they were right, or moral, or powerful. They are remembered because they structured meaning in a way later societies still need. Egypt did not promise freedom. It promised coherence. It did not promise progress. It promised balance. And it did not promise salvation. It promised judgment. These promises were demanding, but they were stable. That stability outlasted belief itself. In the end, Egypt achieved something no empire ever has. It removed itself from competition. By refusing to define success as dominance, it escaped the cycle of rise and fall altogether. It accepted obscurity in exchange for permanence. A civilization that learns how to wait does not fear endings, because it knows endings are temporary. Egypt is not behindiem ready to proceed.